Well, hello everyone. I'm Gillian Mahoney, a reference librarian in the Prints and Photographs division, and I want to welcome you to this month's Finding Pictures, whose theme is all things automotive. As I began preparing for this presentation, I was overwhelmed with the breadth of material we have. So while today I'm only diving into a small sliver, I encourage you all to search in our Prints and Photographs online catalog to see even more. The image you see here is from the Balthazar Korab collection and shows two cars parked in front of Diego Rivera's Detroit Industry murals at the Detroit Institute of Arts. I believe it was taken in the late 1950s or early 1960s. The inspiration for this talk came from my work with the Historic American Engineering Record, or HARE, which is a heritage documentation program founded in 1969 through an agreement with the National Park Service, the Library of Congress, and 5 separate engineering schools to document America's industrial and engineering heritage. The documentation included structures such as mines, bridges, watercrafts, public infrastructure, and since 2013, vehicles. My colleague has provided a link to more information on HARE in the chat if you'd like to learn more about this program. In a previous role in the library, it was my job to accession the HARE surveys as they came in, and I was always delighted when a historic vehicle survey arrived. Right now, there are 21 surveys in our online catalog. More will be coming as more vehicles are added to the register and documented, though it often takes several years for the documentation process to complete. Obviously, I can't talk about them all today, but luckily they are all available to read and review and to download and dig into in our online catalog. Today, I'm going to highlight a few cars in HARE and show how they connect to other collections in our holdings, as well as other ways cars show up in PNP. The first car I'm highlighting is coincidentally the first historic vehicle survey I accessioned back in 2021. This is the 1907 Thomas Flyer, perhaps more famous for its participation in the 1908 New York to Paris race than for its mechanical ingenuity. It was a 4-cylinder engine model manufactured by the E.R. Thomas Motor Company in Buffalo, New York, and entered into the Great Race of 1908. The race itself is a really fascinating piece of automotive history. It was conceived at a time where roads were marginally passable if they existed at all. And 6 international teams, including 1 American team, entered. The Americans were driving in the Thomas Flyer. This here is an example of one of the drawings that I'll be showing throughout the presentation. Most historic vehicle surveys have a few drawings that include some historic text and some photographs. Other drawings include plans and elevations, such as the one here. I know with the level of detail, these are pretty difficult to see, but I encourage you to access them via our catalog and you can really zoom in. You can see here the plan for the Flyer shows 4 seats, with 2 of them being placed pretty significantly behind the rear axle, really hanging off the edge, which is pretty different than cars today. And I don't know about others, but I was astounded to learn that this race was going from New York to Paris, all around the world, and the drivers were going to be racing that route in open-top cars, completely unprotected from the elements. But back to the actual race. The event was heavily documented by journalists and onlookers, so you will find photographs of the race itself, not just the Thomas Flyer, in the Prints and Photographs collections. In fact, an American journalist rode in the Thomas Flyer for several days. These images include many views of the Flyer and the other vehicles en route. As I mentioned earlier, there weren't a lot of roads built for cars at the time, so the competitors often had to drive on railroad tracks or streetcar tracks, such as the ones seen here. And you can really get a sense for the tedium of being stuck behind a streetcar for miles and miles. This photograph I wanted to linger on for a second because there's a lot of great detail in it. We have the snow chains on the tires, very familiar to those of us today in colder climates. You can see the American flag hanging off the back, the extra storage for the cars packed onto the side. I'm going to hop back really quickly to the above slide that shows this drawing that you can see these where the storage was kind of attached to the side of the car. And that is really how the car looked as it was racing. And you can also kind of get a sense for how slow this race really was, especially at the start in the colder climates. It, I think, set off in February from New York. Um, there's a lot of stillness to this image. The cars would also drive across land with no roads of any kind. Like you can see on the image on the left, they're just kind of taking off across the plains. And they were prone to getting stuck in ditches, behind trains, or in snow, as you can see on the right. There was a real spirit of adventure in this race. No one knew exactly when they embarked how they would make it from New York to Paris, but they were confident they would find a way. In fact, when they left New York, the plan was to take the land bridge across the Bering Strait, connecting Alaska to Russia. And from there, it would be presumably smooth sailing to Paris, right? Well, if you were as confused as I was, that's because there was no land bridge across the Bering Strait. The teams ended up taking a steamship from San Francisco to Valdez, Alaska, and then another steamer to Japan. The route from there is too convoluted and complicated for me to expand on completely, but 3 teams of the starting 6 did cross the finish line. The Germans crossed first, the Americans 26 days later, and the Italians over a month after that. The Germans, however, were given a 30-day penalty for shipping, not driving their car through Japan, so the Americans were declared the winners. In our collections, we have images of lots of the cars that participated in this race. So we do have this kind of portrait of the German Protos car taken mid-route in Marshalltown, Pennsylvania, and a photograph of the Italian Zust car taken in New York before the race. As I mentioned earlier, this race was heavily documented, and you'll find many images, particularly of the start in New York, in our George Grantham Bain collection. But to leave the world of early automotive cross-continental racing behind, Princeton Photographs also holds many images of more traditional cars, including many famous Fords. We see advertisements for oil, which provide a brief visual history of Ford automobiles, views of the vintage Fords pristinely maintained, such as this early 1950s Crown Victoria, as seen in 2015, and naturally many, many views of the Ford Model T, including this photograph of the 10 millionth Ford, manufactured in 1924, shown alongside an earlier Ford model. This image is particularly striking when situated next to the Mobil Oil poster or advertisement. You can see that it's a pretty faithful representation of what the cars looked like, particularly that 1898 car with its not steering wheel, but steering stick. But it's not the 10 millionth Ford, which is documented by the Historic American Engineering Record. It's the 15 millionth Ford, which I always struggle to say. This car was the ceremonial last vehicle driven out of the Highland Park plant by Henry and Edsel Ford in 1927, marking the end of the Model T production. As many of you know, the Model T was revolutionary for a few reasons, one of which was because of its production method. Instead of individually built vehicles, Henry Ford envisioned a vehicle that could be mass-produced with interchangeable parts. Also, while Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line production method, he was one of the first to most successfully apply it to automobile manufacturing. Production of these cars began at 12 hours per vehicle in 1908, but by the time of the 15 millionth Model T, a car could be manufactured in 1 hour or less. And remarkably, by 1920, more than half of the cars registered in the world were Fords. Not necessarily Model Ts, but it really shows the influence and reach that the Ford manufacturing had. A part of Ford's vision was to reduce production costs substantially so the Model Ts could be affordable to working class Americans. Princeton Photographs also holds views of the Highland Park plant where the Model T was assembled, giving us an inside glimpse into the mass production assembly line techniques employed there, such as these 2 views showing the chassis on the assembly line, where you can see how the parts were propelled down the belt so that workers could stay stationary while the vehicle moved to them. In these images, you really, especially the one on the right, you get a sense of how the car was moving down the assembly line. I love this image of the manufacturer or worker having to drive this half-finished car off of that mechanized assembly line with the wheels embedded in the factory floor. You can see the tire tracks, or they're not quite tires yet, but the wheel tracks of this car as it moved through the factory, following the tracks of many, many cars before it. Though production of the Model T ended in 1927, Model Ts are seen in the American landscape for decades after. They make several appearances in the Farm Security Administration collection, including this view here of a family fleeing South Dakota for Washington in their Model T, remarkably making it about 200 miles a day in what was, at the very youngest, a 10-year-old car. This image struck me because of the durability and ubiquity of the car. Americans who would have been unable to afford a car in 1910 or 1920 were more likely able to purchase one by 1927. A Model T cost $825 in 1908, $575 in 1912, and $290 by 1927. To put that in perspective, in today's dollars, that is roughly $27,000 in 1908, $18,000 in 1912, and just over $5,000 in 1927. So a remarkable reduction in cost. While we don't know how the Evans family came to own their Model T, we can see that it offered them shelter and transportation during what could have been a tumultuous and traumatic time, even nearly a decade after the Model T was out of production. And the car continues to be seen throughout the decades in our catalog. We have here a view of a 1921 model kept in immaculate shape by its owner, who drove the car to the White House in 1938 in the hopes of seeing Henry Ford, who was scheduled to have lunch with the president. The driver, Ernest A. Frank of Washington, D.C., repeatedly shouted, "Where's Henry?" from the driver's seat while driving around the White House, which did not endear him to police. He was unfortunately escorted off the property before Henry Ford arrived. And jumping almost a century later, we still see images of the Model T, such as this one photographed by Carol Highsmith in 2017 in Georgia, I believe. But the historic American engineering record also includes documentation for less accessible vehicles to the American public, like this 1938 Maserati, the Boyle Special. The Boyle Special, named for Michael Boyle, labor leader and race team owner, is the most successful car to have raced at the Indianapolis 500 mile, winning twice, placing third twice, and coming in fourth once. The car itself was initially designed as a Grand Prix car, but Maserati re-outfitted it with larger tires, lower aluminum body panels, and removed the rear suspension dampers in order to make the car competitive in the Indy 500. And of course, I was delighted to find that P&P has an image of Wilbur Shaw, the 1939 and 1940 Indy 500 winner, posed in the famous Boyle Special. It's a fabulous side-by-side with the hair photograph and this 1940 photograph of Wilbur Shaw, where you can really see how Hare documented this car, and it's in pretty much the same shape that it was in 1940 with the Firestone tires and that long body with, now we can see it in color, which is great too. But it's not just cars from the Indy 500 that are documented in P&P, but the race course itself. We have a promotional poster from 1909, the first year the race course was open, as well as an aerial view of the course over a century later. While many updates have occurred, as you can see in the poster, the track was originally meant to be dirt. You can see kind of the debris and dust flying up behind the leading drivers. It was later paved with brick. Later on, it was paved with asphalt, which is what you see in the iteration on the right, although the track currently still has some of the original brick, which really became like a calling card of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And you can trace the history of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway with our collections, but you can also visually trace the history of race cars and car racing through our collections, such as from this chromolithograph print showing an automobile race in 1907. An obvious difference from today's race cars is the fact that there are two people in this car. One of them seemingly precariously perched, although they are actually sitting in a seat. Race cars at this time were designed with two seats, one for the driver and one for the mechanic or co-driver, who would also serve as a sort of lookout for cars attempting to pass. However, keen eyes may have spotted in the previous slide, so I'm going to show this poster again. Two heads can actually be made out in the promotional poster in each car, or at least in the two with any discernible detail. I'm going to zoom in. It's still very fuzzy, but you can very clearly see that they are meant to be two people in each car. When I first saw the poster, I thought the two heads were a visual indicator for how fast these cars were going. They were traveling, faster than light, but clearly it was accurate to the fact that there were actually two people in each race car. This is especially interesting to note because Hare also has a survey for the Marmon Wasp, which was the first car to win the Indy 500 in 1911. Again, sharp eyes will notice that while I just spoke about how race cars from this era had two seats, this car, in fact, only has one. It was one of the first, if not the first, although that is hard to establish, to forego a mechanic or co-driver for the use of rear view mirrors. The rear view mirror is pretty much impossible to see in this drawing. It's easier to see in the photograph. And I'm going to zoom in even a little bit further so you can see what the rear view mirror looked like. To our modern sensibilities, that doesn't seem particularly useful. You think that your head would be completely blocking the mirror, but it was revolutionary at the time. Think of all the weight that was saved by not having a second person in the car. But we also have stereographs showing race cars, such as this one from 1909 from the Atlanta Motor Speedway, where you can get a better look at the interior of an early 20th century race car, including, as I've been talking way too much about, the presence of that second seat. I wanted to highlight too that in the early 20th century, there were female race car drivers. One, Joan Newton Kneo, successfully raced against both male and female competitors, including setting speed records and winning the 1905 Glidden Tour. The Glidden Tour was a promotional event put on by the American Automobile Association, or AAA, in the hopes of promoting better road safety. She continued to race until 1908, when the AAA banned women from racing, functionally ending her career. She continued to participate in the Good and Safe Roads movement following this ban, but was no longer allowed to race cars. Less is known about Catherine Drexel Dahlgreen's racing career, if there was one. She was photographed here after the ban was in place. But we see her pictured in her racing auto in the early 20th century. I couldn't find reference to any races she participated in, but I did find a 1915 notice in the New York Times that read, quote, "Miss Kay Dahlgreen held for speeding. Dahlgren was arrested this afternoon in Stockbridge on charge of speeding her automobile 90 miles an hour on the main street," end quote. So whether women were banned from racing or not, Drexel certainly was going to try her hand. As the century progressed, the elaborateness of motor racing expanded. Between 1912 and 1914, Barney Oldfield, a pioneer racing driver who won the inaugural AAA National Championship, competed against aviator Lincoln Beechey in a series of races between car and plane for the Speed Championship of the world. The driver and aviator traded places back and forth, hoping to entertain audience more so than to really establish the Speed Championship of the world. And as the popularity of automobile racing increased, more and more tracks were being built. Following the success of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the Cincinnati Motor Speedway, a wooden track, ran from 1916 to 1919, seen here in this panorama. Others may know more about the history of this particular race course, but my understanding is that it was so short-lived because the wood was didn't hold up so well in the Cincinnati environment. The heavy snows, the rain, the change in humidity were very hard on the wooden tracks. So while wooden tracks were pretty popular in this time period, and there were actually a few in Washington, D.C. that are documented in our Bain collection, and you can see in our catalog, they didn't last very long. They were very, very difficult to maintain. And so later on, brick and then much later asphalt was much preferred. And while only a few images have yet been digitized, you can also see views of more recent Indy 500 races, like these few stills from the Look magazine collection, taken in 1968 of driver Dan Gurney and his team. Even though you can really only see the thumbnail of the car here, you can certainly get a sense of how much these cars have changed since the early days of the Indy 500. But to wrap up talking about race cars, I wanted to finish with this fabulous image from the Talladega Motor Speedway in Alabama from 2010 to show just how varied race cars continue to be and how unrecognizable they are from their predecessors over a century ago. So to change gears, forgive me, the historic American engineering record doesn't only document passenger vehicles, as shown by its recent survey of the General Motors Futureliner number 6. 12 of these Futureliners were originally manufactured for the 1939 New York World's Fair. They were later used for GM's Parade of Progress, which was a mobile science and technology exhibition that first toured the country in 1941, only to stop a few months later when the United States entered World War II. It later toured again between 1953 and 1956. These were not designed for people, but rather designed to maximize display and exhibit space. Each of the 12 Futureliners held a unique exhibit in its hull, with the goal of promoting technological advancement in automobiles. This particular Futureliner housed the exhibit Energy and Man, and later High Compression Power and Energy exhibit. Other exhibits included the Diesel Power Parade, Out of the City Muddle, which focused on decongesting highways, and my favorite, an exhibit housed in Futureliner number 11, A Car is Born. I wanted to show some examples of photographs from the hair surveys as well, which highlight the details of the cars, such as the steering wheel, and we have a gear shift of this Futureliner. The hair surveys are to document not just the aesthetic value, but to show the functionality and mechanical ingenuity of the vehicles. So many of the photographs are of engines and parts, not just kind of beautiful shots of the car's exteriors. But as I mentioned before, the Parade of Progress took a long break, and in between those two tours of the Futureliner fleet, many General Motors automobile plants converted to producing machinery for the war efforts. The Office of War Information documented many former automobile manufacturing plants and workers who made such a shift. And while GM certainly wasn't the only automobile manufacturer who pivoted to making war machinery, these images show works at GM plants, such as a manufacturer at the Cleveland Diesel Engine Division of a GM plant manufacturing war machinery now, or work done in the Oldsmobile division of the General Motors Corps in Lansing, Michigan, where they transitioned to manufacturing artillery shells. And on the far right, we have a machine operator in the AC spark plug division in Flint, Michigan, who transitioned into making machine gun parts. And if not for the war effort, the woman pictured here may not have been employed in the GM plant. These images, while not of automobiles themselves, demonstrate the reach that the automotive industry had at this time. After World War II, naturally, GM plants returned to automobile manufacturing, and P&P has several collections that document these assembly plants. The image on the left is from the U.S. News and World Report collection, showing the interior of a Chevrolet GM plant in Baltimore, Maryland. And the image on the right is from the Bernard Gottfried collection, showing the interior workings of a GM plant in Linden, New Jersey. I had to include these images to show the continued use of the assembly line model, which we saw first all those slides ago in the Highland Park plant. And the assembly lines here are a little bit different from each other. In the plant in Baltimore, the assembly line is raised. The car is kind of at hip height as it moves through the plant. And in the plant in New Jersey, the assembly line is built into the factory floor, so the cars just continuously roll. I had to include a few more images from the Linden, New Jersey plant, as I think they're so wonderful, and because the assembly line here has the cars hanging from the ceiling so that manufacturers and workers maybe don't have to stoop over to reach the tire wells. They can just do that while standing. And then it's worthwhile to show an image of what these manufactured cars looked when they were complete. And as cars became more and more commonplace and necessary to get around as practical machines, people continued to innovate and develop vehicles for both on and off-road, such as the original fiberglass dune buggy, the Myers Manx, designed by Bruce Myers, the vehicle that really began an explosion of off-road vehicle development and prompted an off-road racing phenomenon, to quote the Myers Manx's Historic Engineering Survey. The Manx was initially a car with no commercial intention, but eventually the dune buggy was sold as a kit. So it was sold with everything needed to build the dune buggy except for the major mechanical components and running gear. And here we have some of the hair photos that really kind of get into the details of the engine and the built pieces, as well as the aesthetic value of the car. Myers was inspired by cartoon cars, so those such as the ones Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse drove, or cartoon cars he found in newspapers. He was also inspired by cars that he saw individually re-outfitted to drive on the sand, including several such Volkswagen Beetles that he would see in and around his neighborhood in Southern California. In fact, the Myers Manx was designed around the Beetle's suspension, engine, and mechanical components. However, the Manx did not use a Volkswagen chassis, but instead originally had a body made entirely of fiberglass that was strong enough so that it didn't need a steel body to support or as support. Although many later buggies did incorporate steel to reinforce the frame and make them that more durable. These images are great because you can see kind of the similar silhouette, although they clearly don't share all the full silhouette. They are very different vehicles. The Manx was broadcast to a wider audience through the 1968 movie The Thomas Crown Affair, where Steve McQueen played the titular Thomas Crown, who drove a modified version of the Manx. We don't have an image of this particular Manx, but McQueen is seen here posing, though in sand, with not a dune buggy, but a dirt bike. But due to the popularity of the Myers Manx and like vehicles, off-road motorsports racing continued to explode in popularity, with motorists often adapting and re-outfitting their vehicles to best suit their needs and skills. This, however, was built on a long tradition of customizing cars. People would customize cars for drag racing, for varying terrains, as well as for aesthetics. Around the same time that the Myers Manx was gaining in popularity, another automotive trend was booming in Southern California, lowriding. Custom car styles have been developing in Southern California, notably in the Mexican-American barrios of East Los Angeles since the mid-1940s. But it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that this trend flourished. Hare documents one such car, Gypsy Rose, a 1964 Chevrolet Impala, customized by the Valadez brothers in 1970 and featuring highly ornate multicolored paint jobs in addition to the classic lowered suspension. The interior even had a cocktail bar and chandeliers fitted as interior lights. Gypsy Rose would be featured in a primetime sitcom, Chico and the Man, in countless magazines, and would be declared by Lowrider magazine as the world's most popular lowrider. These cars were designed as an artistic expression and for style, not for performance. And I really wanted to take a second here to look at the intricacies of this car and show how detailed and ornate the detailing in the paint job was. Unfortunately, I wish I had a color image to show you of Gypsy Rose, but even in this black and white image, you can really appreciate the level of care that went into customizing this car. And you can also see the fabulous bench seat that's in the back. We have more examples of contemporary customized lowriders in our collections, but I included here this image by Carol Highsmith, which is portraying a lowrider Noland Martinez in Northwest New Mexico. And it really shows how influential these figures and this custom was to communities. But one of the more recent cars documented by the Historic American Engineering Record became perhaps one of the most ubiquitous cars in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and that is the minivan. This specific car, the Magic Van #1, touched off a shift in the concept of a family car. It was easy to drive, it was easy to get in and out of, it fit in a standard garage, and it opened the interior space for additional passengers and storage. While initially viewed as a risky endeavor, by the end of the first year on the market, 21,000 had been sold, and manufacturing was struggling to keep up with demand. I'll show here the plan and elevations for this vehicle, so you can just get a sense for how different it is than the other cars that we have been looking at. Because our collections are strongest pre-1980, there are fewer images of the minivan, though I'd imagine this will change with time. However, minivans appear throughout our collections in the background of images, often not as the focus, such as the image on the left, which appears in another Hare survey, not documenting any historic vehicles, but instead a survey for the Standard Gold Mill in Mono County, California. This is perhaps a good time to mention that while the images I've shown in the presentation are often indexed for automobiles, which is the thesaurus for graphic materials term we use, cars frequently show up in our collections in the background and are not the main subject, so they won't necessarily be indexed as automobile. I mentioned this to encourage you to search creatively in our catalog. A search for streets returns many, many views of cars that are not returned when you simply search for automobiles. But back to the minivan. It was enough of a cultural moment to even be covered in 1991 by Roll Call, a newspaper published in DC reporting on the goings-on on Capitol Hill, as seen here in just this quick snapshot of the contact sheet for that story and all these different views of the Plymouth minivan. I'm going to step away now from looking at cars documented in Hare and their related materials in our collections and turn to cars and vehicles not yet documented by Hare and P&P, including electric vehicles. Even though they have never been the preferred vehicle, the US has been producing EVs of some type or another since the mid-19th century. Some preferred electric vehicles because they did not require a manual or a crank to start, so they were a little bit easier to get going. So they were often marketed as luxury cars for women and as the ideal city car because of their limited range. Range anxiety is as old as cars themselves. One such early electric vehicle was the Detroit Electric, produced by the Anderson Car Company. About 13,000 of these vehicles were produced from 1907 to 1939. The car seen here is on a promotional journey from Seattle to Mount Rainier in 1918. But much simpler electric vehicles like this buckboard had been in production even earlier. While this specific one, well, this photograph was taken in 1928, and we don't know exactly when this buckboard was made. More simple ones had been created since the latter half of the 19th century, including this electric motor carriage, which was photographed in 1901. This image strikes me because of the orientation of the second seat. So I'm just imagining two more people in this car facing the driver and the passenger and how much that would reduce visibility perhaps. But there were much fewer cars on the road in 1901, so maybe that was far less of a problem. And as the 20th century wore on, many people continued to manufacture and promote electric vehicle usage. While electric vehicles never went away, they faded dramatically in popularity, and most people favored gas-powered internal combustion engines. But the environmental impacts of gas vehicles were increasingly apparent, even in the mid-20th century. In the 1960s and 70s, US News and World Report did several stories on electric vehicles, often showing politicians or companies promoting EV usage. One such model was the Renault Dauphine Yardney, also known as the Henny Kilowatt, pictured on the left, which only ever sold 47 models over 2 years. In the middle, we have an EV that looks remarkably like kind of an angular smart car. And on the right, we have an experimental electric car from 1976, which used solar energy and was displayed at a conservation exhibit in DC. The push of electric vehicles into there was also a push of electric vehicles into public infrastructure, like this electric bus displayed outside the Energy Department in Washington, D.C. from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga in the 1990s was on the forefront of the push for electric buses. By 1994, 9 of the 62 city buses were electric, making it the largest fleet in the nation at the time. I don't know if all of their buses now are electric, but it would be interesting to see if this trend continued. But there are other ways to learn about automotive history through our collections, including through illustrations and posters. In the early 20th century, cars were often depicted as the height of glamour, which you can see by these Edward Penfield posters. The cars here are really kind of being used as accessories to the fabulous women, and there's clearly a long tradition of women posing with cars in advertisements, in promotional materials, etc. And we can see that clearly as early as 1906. We also have this stunning advertisement for a new safety Stutz car. The Stutz automobiles were seen as a somewhat counter to the everyman's Ford. They were high-end luxury vehicles, and while they eventually manufactured and sold over 39,000 cars, the company did not survive the Great Depression and closed in 1934. But cars were not all glamour. They posed new threats, and in our Projects Administration poster collection, we have a few posters serving as public service announcements for the perils of driving, such as this poster from the Iowa State Safety Council, which instructs drivers on how much space they need for braking at various speeds, or this poster from the National Park Service, highlighting the dangers motorists can pose to wildlife. We can also learn how cars impacted the built environment through our architecture, design, and engineering collections. Here we have a design for a service station designed by Arthur B. Heaton, a Washington, D.C. based architect in 1934. The design looked pretty unfamiliar to me as a gas or service station standing in 2024. With its elegant facade and clock tower, the design itself doesn't feel very car-centric, with kind of wider sidewalks and narrower driveways. There's no real space for parking. You're not quite sure how the traffic flow is supposed to go. But just a year later, Heaton dramatically changed the design for the same property. We don't exactly know why. We don't have the documentation for why, but it's fascinating to compare these two designs. He transitioned to much wider driveways and narrower sidewalks with the service and gas stations available from the cars themselves. This is very difficult to see on your screen, I appreciate, so I'll zoom in just a little to show the gas and service stations. And you can clearly see there's more direction for traffic. We have our concrete islands, and the cars have more knowledge about where they're supposed to go as opposed to the earlier design. And we can also see the change over time for the built landscape of cars while looking at photographs of gas stations. While of course it's not just time, but place that impacts these designs, you can still see the shift from this 1940 image of a gas and service station in New Mexico to a gas station in 1979, excuse me, which this was amidst the oil shortage, which is why this gas station in particular feels so chaotic. But you can still see the structure looks almost entirely different from the one in 1940. We can see gas and service stations built decades before, updated and still in use in the 1980s. And of course, we have contemporary gas stations, those of the kind that litter the American landscape today. And there are drawings and plans of structures like drive-in theaters, such as the Benji's Drive-In in Middle River, Maryland, from the Jack Vogel Drive-In Theater Drawing Collection, which can give us an insight into how spaces that used to be designed for people, traditional theaters, were being rethought of as spaces for cars. I'll zoom in here a little bit to highlight some details. This section of the drawing helped me understand the scale a little bit more. You can see the ticket office and the manager's office and how small they are. So this drawing is really about cars and not people. You can see here again the flow of traffic scene. The small dots on the right-hand side of the screen are where the cars were supposed to park. And the architect and engineer here is responsible for car traffic, not just people traffic. And if we zoom in here, this section shows how cars enter the drive-in and even notes the placement of the attraction sign, which we coincidentally have an image of from the Historic American Landscape Survey, a sister collection to HAIR, in addition to drive-in theater signs from other archives. Here I've included a sign from Houston, Texas, found in the John Margulies Roadside America Ephemera collection. But it would be a shame to spend all this time talking about cars and not mention the thorn in the side of most drivers, the thorn that is parking. P&P has several views of parking garages, but none more striking, in my opinion, than some of Paul Rudolph's designs for the Temple Street parking garage in New Haven, Connecticut. Designed at a time when many architects wanted to revolutionize parking garages so that they would become communal spaces, much like train stations had become, a vision that has never really come to pass. I can't speak for anyone else, but I've never gone to a parking garage and felt kind of a shared experience with other people parking. While Rudolph's drawings are often enticing and full of life, his reliance on concrete often meant these structures were more imposing than welcoming, which we can really see in the photos of the built structures. You can see the almost complete absence of light penetrating into the parking garage, especially on the image on the right. Some may consider it a metaphor for the bleakness that is the quest for parking. And that concludes our finding pictures for this month. I wanted to mention our December finding pictures, which highlight newly processed or collections currently being processed in P&P and will be held on December 18th at 3 p.m.